Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving deep into the critique of Pushpa 2, The Rule.
Okay.
And the first film, Pushpa The Rise, was just such a phenomenon.
It was.
Really changed the game for Telugu cinema. But this critique is suggesting that the sequel might not have quite lived up to the original.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating about this critique is that it acknowledges the sequel's visual spectacle and box office success. I mean, it was huge, even internationally.
Yeah.
But kind of raises this question, can all the glitz and glamour overshadow the actual substance of the story?
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so let's jump right into the specifics.
Yeah.
The critique starts by focusing on that opening scene. That massive, visually stunning fight sequence set in Japan.
Yeah.
On paper, it sounds incredible.
Right.
But the author is arguing that it just feels jarringly disconnected from the main plot.
Yeah, and that disconnect actually brings up a really important filmmaking principle, the balance between style and substance.
Yeah.
You can have this flashy scene that's visually impressive, of course, but if it doesn't actually serve the narrative, it can end up kind of taking away from the overall impact of the film.
Right.
It's like if you were to add a high-octane car chase to a quiet, introspective drama, it might be fun to watch on its own.
Yeah.
But it just wouldn't make sense in the context of the story.
Right. It's like putting a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have this visually stunning but slightly out of place action sequence to kick things off.
Yeah.
And then the critique moves on to another concern, the supporting characters.
Right.
Specifically Anasuya Bharadwaj and Mangalam Srinu. Now, for those who haven't seen the first film, Anasuya plays Dakshayani, Pushpa's stepmother, a powerful figure in her own right. And then you have Mangalam Srinu, who plays a character named Konda Reddy,
Right.
who in the first film was this constant thorn in Pushpa's side, just adding to the tension and drama.
Yeah, he was great.
But in the sequel, the critique argues that both of their roles just feel underdeveloped.
And I think that's a point worth exploring a bit further.
Yeah.
Because it connects to this bigger conversation about ensemble casts and their impact on storytelling.
Yeah.
Think about films like The Avengers or Ocean's 11.
Right.
They're packed with these memorable characters.
Yeah.
Each with their own motivations and arcs. And the interplay between them just makes the story so much richer.
For sure.
When a film neglects its supporting characters, it can feel like it's missing a crucial ingredient. That spark that elevates a good story to a truly great one.
Yeah.
In the case of Pushpa 2, diminishing these characters, especially Mangalam Srinu, who provided so much conflict in the first film, it weakens the emotional core of the narrative.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
You need those supporting characters to add layers to the story, to create those subplots and those relationships that make the world feel fully realized.
It's like a tapestry. The more intricate the threads are, the richer and more vibrant the final image.
Exactly. And speaking of characters who deserve more attention, the critique was particularly disappointed with how Rashmika Mandanna's character, Sravali, was handled.
Yes, sir.
In Pushpa, The Rise. She was portrayed as this strong, independent woman, someone who could hold her own against Pushpa's kind of rough exterior.
She was great.
But this critique is arguing that the sequel kind of reduces her to a more stereotypical and honestly disappointing trope.
Yeah.
Which is a shame because her character had so much potential.
Yeah, it is a shame.
I remember watching the first film and feeling like Sravali was just such a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
She wasn't just a love interest, she was a character with agency, with her own dreams and desires.
Exactly.
So to hear that the sequel didn't capitalize on that it kind of fell back on such a tired and honestly outdated trope, it's definitely a letdown.
It really makes you think about how female characters are often portrayed in sequels, especially in these action-heavy genres. Are filmmakers afraid to let them be both strong and vulnerable, to allow them to grow beyond the initial impression they made in the first film? It's a question worth considering as we analyze Pushpa 2 and its choices.
Yeah, I think you've hit on something really important there. It's not just about representation. It's about allowing female characters to be fully realized individuals.
Absolutely.
To have the same depth and complexity as their male counterparts.
Exactly.
And the critique seems to be arguing that Pushpa 2 missed an opportunity to do that with Sravali.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. And this leads us to another criticism leveled at the sequel, its handling of Pushpa's personal struggles.
So the critique is saying that while Pushpa 2 definitely ramps up the scale of the conflicts, it loses some of that emotional weight that made the first film so compelling.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. The critique argues that the sequel While it's definitely full of action and drama, it doesn't really delve into the internal struggles that made Pushpa such a captivating character in the first place.
You know, now that you mention it, I remember feeling so invested in Pushpa's journey in Pushpa, The Rise. You really saw his ambition, his vulnerability, his fierce loyalty to those he cared about. It wasn't just about him rising to power. It was about those internal battles he was fighting along the way.
Exactly. And those internal battles, those moments of introspection and self-doubt, they're often what resonate most deeply with audiences. Think about a film like The Dark Knight. Yes, it's a superhero film with those spectacular action sequences. But what makes it truly memorable is the exploration of Bruce Wayne's internal struggles, his grappling with morality and sacrifice. It's those human moments, those glimpses into the character's soul that elevate a film from being simply entertaining to being truly profound.
It's like we can all relate to those internal struggles, right?
Absolutely.
We've all had those moments of doubt, those times when we question our choices and wonder if we're on the right path.
Yeah.
So when we see characters wrestling with those same emotions, it creates this powerful connection. But it sounds like the critique is saying Pushpa 2 missed an opportunity to tap into that emotional depth.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway. And it connects to another point raised in the critique, that underdeveloped plot surrounding Pushpa's kidnapped niece.
Ah, yes. This was a major plot point in the sequel, but the critique found it lacking in emotional impact.
Right. The argument is that the film doesn't really spend enough time establishing the relationship between Pushpa and his niece. So when she's kidnapped, the stakes don't feel as high as they should.
I see what you mean. It's like, imagine if Finding Nemo had skipped over all those heartwarming scenes between Marlin and Nemo at the beginning.
Right.
Would we have felt the same desperation, the same urgency in Marlin's quest to find his son? Probably not.
Precisely. Those early scenes, those seemingly small moments of connection, they actually lay the groundwork for the emotional payoff later on. Without that foundation, even a high-stakes event like a kidnapping can fall flat.
So basically, the critique is suggesting that Pushpa 2, while delivering on the action and spectacle, stumbles a bit when it comes to those crucial emotional beats.
That's a pretty fair assessment, and it brings up a broader question about what audiences value in sequels.
Yeah.
Are we content with simply more of the same? Or are we craving a deeper exploration of the characters and themes that captivated us in the first film?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we all want to be entertained, to be swept away by a good story.
Of course.
But I also think there's a growing desire for something more, for films that challenge us and move us and leave us with something to ponder long after the credits have rolled.
Yeah, and speaking of challenges, the critique also takes issue with the lack of a truly compelling antagonist in Pushpa 2.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they argue that no one really fills the shoes of Mangalam Srinu's character from the first film, which means that the stakes never felt quite as high.
Yeah, I can see that. A formidable antagonist can really elevate a film,
For sure.
They push the protagonist to their limits, force them to grow and evolve.
Absolutely.
When you think about some of the most iconic films, they often have these equally iconic villains. You think Darth Vader, Hannibal Lecter, or even the Joker.
Right.
These antagonists aren't just obstacles.
Yeah.
They're complex characters in their own right.
Exactly.
With motivations and desires that clash with the heroes.
That clash of personalities and ideologies, that's what creates that dramatic tension that keeps us glued to the screen.
For sure.
Yeah.
And without a worthy opponent, even the most heroic protagonist can seem a bit flat.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I see your point about spectacle versus substance, but I wonder if there are times when spectacle can actually enhance the emotional core of a film. Take Mad Max, Fury Road, for example. It's a visual masterpiece, this adrenaline-fueled spectacle from beginning to end.
Yeah.
But it also has this really powerful emotional undercurrent. This message about hope and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds.
That's an excellent point, Mad Max. Fury Road is a prime example of how spectacle and substance can work in perfect harmony. The visual brilliance of the film actually serves to amplify the emotional stakes of the story, not distract from them. And you're right, that film has a lot to say about the human spirit's ability to persevere, even in the most dire circumstances.
It's like the spectacle becomes a tool for storytelling, a way to heighten the emotional impact of the narrative.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of another example, Gravity, with Sandra Bullock.
Oh yeah, great film.
The vastness of space, the sheer isolation of the protagonist.
Right.
It all served to emphasize her vulnerability,
Yeah.
her incredible will to survive.
You're absolutely right. And that's where Pushpa 2, according to the critique, seems to miss the mark. The spectacle, while impressive, feels somewhat detached from the emotional core of the story. It's like two separate tracks running parallel to each other, but never quite converging.
So it sounds like the key is intentionality. When spectacle is used thoughtfully, when it serves to reinforce the themes and emotions of the story,
Right.
it can elevate a film to new heights.
Yeah.
But when it's simply there for its own sake,
Right.
it can leave the audience feeling a bit cold, despite all the visual fireworks.
That's a great way to put it. It's about finding that sweet spot, that delicate balance between dazzling the senses and engaging the heart.
And speaking of engagement, the critique also calls out the film for being a bit too predictable. It argues that the plot lacked those surprising twists and turns that keep audiences on the edge of their seats.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, predictability can be a double-edged sword in storytelling.
It can.
On one hand, you want the audience to feel like the story is unfolding logically, that the characters' actions make sense.
Right.
But on the other hand, you don't want them to feel like they know exactly what's going to happen next.
Of course not.
A good story finds that balance,
Yeah.
offering enough familiarity to keep the audience grounded, but also enough surprises to keep them engaged.
You know, it's like a roller coaster ride. You want those moments of anticipation, those climbs and drops that make your heart race.
Right.
But if you knew exactly when every twist and turn was coming, it wouldn't be nearly as thrilling, would it?
No, not at all. It's those moments of surprise, those unexpected deviations from the anticipated path
Yeah.
that keep us invested in the story.
Sure.
They make us question our assumptions, reevaluate the characters, and ultimately become more actively involved in the narrative.
Absolutely.
I'm reminded of a film I saw recently, Knives Out.
Oh, yeah?
I went in expecting a fairly straightforward murder mystery, but the film kept subverting my expectations, throwing in these clever twists and turns that kept me guessing until the very end.
Knives Out. A brilliant example of a film that plays with audience expectations, keeps us constantly on our toes.
Exactly.
And that's what Pushpa 2, according to this critique, seems to be missing. It relies a bit too heavily on familiar tropes and plot devices, sacrificing some of that element of surprise. That can make a story truly captivating.
Yeah, it feels like this critique is really urging filmmakers to remember that audiences crave more than just visual thrills. We want to be moved, challenged, and ultimately left with something to think about long after the credits roll.
Absolutely. And this ties back to something we were discussing earlier, the importance of personal stakes. When we see characters grappling with those internal conflicts, making those tough choices and ultimately transforming as a result of their experiences, that's what really stays with us.
So what does this all mean for Pushpa 2? It sounds like the critique, while acknowledging its strengths, ultimately argues that it misses the mark in some key areas.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily a condemnation of the film as a whole. It's more of a call for filmmakers to really consider that delicate balance between spectacle and substance, between delivering on those audience expectations for action and excitement, while also crafting a narrative that is emotionally engaging and thought-provoking.
It makes you wonder, how much do we as viewers value emotional depth and character development in these action-packed films? Are we content with just a visual feast, or are we craving something more?
That's a really great question to leave our listeners with. It's something to ponder as they watch not just Pushpa 2, but any film that attempts to walk that line between entertainment and artistry. Because ultimately, the most rewarding cinematic experiences are those that engage both our hearts and our minds.
Well said. I think this deep dive into the critique of Pushpa 2 has given us all plenty to think about. What started as an analysis of one film has really opened up this broader conversation about storytelling and character development and the power of cinema to move us on a deeper level.
And that's the beauty of a deep dive, isn't it?
Yeah.
We start with a single source, a single perspective, but it can lead us to a much richer understanding of the topic and its wider implications.
Absolutely. So thank you all for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it as insightful and entertaining as we did. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. We encourage you to share your own thoughts on Pushpa 2 and to continue exploring these themes in the films you watch and the stories you experience.